In the blizzard, two small figures struggled against nature, slowly trudging through the snow, a tiny German shepherd dog clutching their arm. It seems to be their only remaining possession. Not far away, a small house is buried under the snowstorm. Inside, a Navy SEAL sits by a fire with his loyal service dog. The man, fleeing from a past both glorious and tragic, thought his days of rescue work were over until a weak, desperate, trembling knock sounded at the door. What happens next will remind him and the world that sometimes the smallest creatures bring about the greatest miracles. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Subscribe for more. The storm had swallowed the mountains whole. Wind screamed between the pines like a choir of ghosts, and the snow fell sideways, driven by a wrath only Montana winters could know. Inside a small log cabin, a single flame trembled in the iron stove, fighting against the breath of the cold that seeped through the cracks. Ethan Cole sat by that stove, elbows on his knees, hands clasped beneath his chin. Once, those hands had carried lives out of fire, hands of a Navy SEAL K-9 handler, trained for war, not for quiet. He was 38, tall, with shoulders broad as the cabin beams, his frame still carrying the discipline of years in service. His hair, once black, had grown into a rough chestnut brown streaked with ash, and a short beard darkened his square jaw. But his eyes, steel gray, sharp yet weary, betrayed what no scar could, the emptiness of a man who had outlived his purpose. Beside him lay Ranger, his partner of 6 years. The German shepherd's coat shimmered with shades of black and tan, thick and coarse, his right flank marked by a long, pale scar that told its own story. A roadside explosion in Helmand the day they'd both stopped being soldiers. Ranger was 7 now, loyal as ever, though slower, more thoughtful in his movements. His golden eyes followed every flicker of firelight, ears twitching at the faintest sound. The two of them understood silence better than words. Both had survived things that did not need speaking. Outside, the storm clawed at the cabin walls. Snow rattled against the window panes, and the wind carried strange voices, branches snapping, the groan of the forest under ice. Ethan listened without reaction. He had learned long ago that nature did not care about men, and men who expected mercy from it were fools. He poured a cup of lukewarm coffee from the dented kettle and stared into the steam. His thoughts drifted where they always did when the world went quiet, the night of the fire, the call that came while he was overseas, the image of his wife, Anna, her auburn hair tangled with smoke, their small house reduced to embers, their son, 3 years old, gone before he could remember his father's voice. The guilt lived in his chest like a second heartbeat. He had been saving lives in a foreign desert while his own family had burned alone. A sharp sound jolted him, 3 knocks, faint, uneven, nearly lost in the storm. Ethan froze, the mug halfway to his lips. Ranger's head shot up, ears high, a low growl rumbling from his chest. Ethan held his breath. No one should be out there. The nearest road was buried in snow, and he hadn't seen another soul in months. He waited, counting the seconds between gusts. Then 3 more knocks, weaker this time. He rose slowly, instinct pulling old habits back into place. He slipped on his worn field jacket, grabbed the flashlight by the door, and motioned to Ranger. Stay. The command came naturally, firm but quiet. Ranger obeyed, though his tail stiffened, ready. When Ethan unlatched the door, the wind slammed into him with a roar, snow whipping across his face like needles. For a heartbeat, the world outside was nothing but white chaos. Then, through the swirl, He saw movement, a figure bent double, clutching something small to their chest. Behind them, another shape stumbled forward, half collapsing. Ethan stepped into the snowdrift, boots sinking to his calves. "Hey!" he shouted over the gale. "Here!" The first figure turned toward his voice. A woman. No, not a woman. An older man, face hidden beneath layers of frost and a wool hat. His beard was white, heavy with ice. Beside him, another person struggled to keep upright. A small, frail woman whose hair had turned silver long ago, strands escaping from beneath her hood. Her arms cradled a trembling bundle wrapped in a blanket. Ethan waded toward them. The old man tried to speak, but only coughed, snow caking his lashes. "Please," he rasped. "The dog." Ethan reached them just as the woman's knees gave way. He caught her by the shoulders, light as kindling, cold as stone. The bundle in her arms whimpered. It wasn't a child, but a puppy, a German shepherd no older than 6 weeks, fur soaked and matted with ice. "Inside," Ethan barked, half carrying them back through the doorway. He kicked the door shut with his boot, sealing out the storm, the cabin filled with their labored breathing. The old man leaned against the wall, shaking uncontrollably. His name, he would soon learn, was Henry Parker, 76, a retired lumberman from Whitefish. Tall but stooped, with shoulders that had known decades of work, and hands that still bore the memory of axe and rope. His skin was weathered, lined deep by years of mountain winters, and his blue eyes, though dim with exhaustion, still held a spark of defiance. The woman beside him was Martha Parker, 72, thin and pale beneath her wind-burned cheeks. She had the steady movements of someone who had spent her life tending others. Once a nurse, long retired but still carrying the calm of those who had seen death often enough not to fear it. Even now, half frozen, she worried not for herself, but for the small creature in her arms. Ethan guided them toward the fire. "Sit, both of you." He took the blanket-wrapped puppy and set it gently near the stove. Ranger rose from his spot, sniffed the air, then approached, tail low but curious. The puppy let out a weak whine, tiny paws twitching. Without command, Ranger lay beside it, curling his large body to block the draft, his warmth enveloping the smaller life. Martha reached for the fire, her thin fingers trembling. "We lost the road," she whispered, her voice hoarse from cold. "Car stopped working. I thought we could make it on foot. We didn't think it would get this bad." Henry gave a short, bitter laugh that turned into a cough. "I told her we should have stayed, but she's stubborn." He tried to smile at his wife, though his lips were cracked and pale. Ethan poured water from the kettle into 2 metal cups and handed them over. "You're lucky you found this place. There's nothing out here for miles." Martha looked around the cabin. Bare walls, a cot, a small table, and shelves lined with canned food and ammunition. "You live here alone?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Just me and him." He nodded toward Ranger. The old man studied him a moment, noticing the posture, the scars, the distant look that soldiers carried long after leaving the battlefield. "Army?" "SEAL," Ethan said simply. Henry's eyes flickered with recognition, the kind that needed no further explanation. He had fought his own battles once, different wars, same ghosts. "You got that look," he murmured, "the one men get when they've seen too much." Ethan didn't answer. He crouched beside the puppy, rubbing it gently with a towel. Its fur began to fluff, steam rising as the ice melted. The little thing blinked up at him with dark, glassy eyes, too tired to move. Ranger gave a soft huff, pressing his nose against its side as if lending his strength. "What's his name?" Ethan asked quietly. "Scout," Martha said, a smile ghosting across her lips. "Our grandson named him before he passed." The words hung heavy in the air. Ethan froze for a heartbeat, the towel still in his hand. Loss, recognized loss. He looked at the couple, two people who had lost everything yet still carried this fragile spark of life through a storm just to keep it breathing. Henry sipped his water, watching the fire. "We had a little farm up north. Burned down last summer. Guess the mountain wanted it back." He chuckled dryly. "We've been trying to reach our niece in Bozeman. Thought the road would be clear." Ethan nodded slowly. He understood that stubborn hope, the refusal to give up even when the world said it was time. Ranger shifted beside the stove, laying his head protectively near Scout. The puppy gave a small sigh and fell asleep against the larger dog's chest. Ethan found himself staring at the scene longer than he meant to. There was something almost sacred about it. The soldier, the elder couple, the two dogs, each scarred, each surviving in their own way. Martha's voice broke the silence. "Thank you, Mr. Cole," he said. "Ethan Cole." "Well, Mr. Cole," she murmured, "you've saved 3 souls tonight." He shook his head, staring into the flames. "Just open the door." But even as he said it, something stirred in his chest. Something small, unwelcome, but alive. A warmth not from the fire, but from the sight of life clinging to life. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the faintest tremor of purpose. The storm roared outside, beating against the walls, but inside the cabin, the world had changed. Henry dozed off in the chair. Martha leaned back with a blanket around her shoulders, and Ranger kept his watch over the sleeping puppy. Ethan sat by the fire long into the night, listening to their breathing, the crack of the wood, and the distant cry of wind that no longer frightened him. The door had closed, the storm could rage, but for now, inside that fragile cabin of warmth and light, something that had long been frozen began to thaw. Morning came gray and slow, dragging the weight of the storm with it. The snow still fell, quieter now, drifting like feathers across the frozen trees outside Ethan Cole's cabin. Inside, the air carried the scent of damp wool and pine smoke. The stove crackled, its orange heart pulsing steadily, and in that fragile light the world seemed to breathe again, though faintly. Ethan sat by the window, elbows on his knees, watching the fog rise over the mountains. His face, still marked by fatigue and stubble, caught the thin rays of dawn. His uniform jacket hung over the back of a chair, its fabric faded, patches frayed. He had worn it through too many wars, yet somehow it was here, in peace among strangers, that it felt the heaviest. Behind him, the soft murmur of movement filled the room. Henry Parker stirring awake, Martha humming faintly, the whisper of paws on wood. Martha Parker, wrapped in one of Ethan's old blankets, sat near the fire feeding small pieces of wood into the stove. Her silver hair, once tightly coiled, now fell in gentle disarray over her shoulders. Age had softened the sharpness of her features, but her eyes, pale blue and endlessly kind, carried a quiet steadiness. She moved slowly, but there was precision in every gesture, the discipline of a woman who had once treated soldiers in battlefield tents and whispered comfort to the dying while shells burst outside. Henry Parker sat opposite her, his weathered hands wrapped around a tin mug of coffee. His frame was stooped, but his presence filled the room. He had the solid build of a man who'd once split wood and repaired fences, shoulders still broad despite his years. His gray beard framed a mouth that smiled rarely, but when it did, it carried warmth like a small fire against the cold. His eyes, brown and shrewd, often lingered on Martha with a kind of reverence that came only from decades of shared storms. Scout, the puppy they had carried through the blizzard, now lay curled in Ranger's shadow. His tiny black and tan body rose and fell with every fragile breath. Ranger, older and massive beside him, lay motionless except for the slow flick of his tail, keeping the younger one pressed against his warmth. The sight stirred something gentle in Ethan, a memory of fatherhood, of a small boy reaching for his hand once, and the sound of laughter that now lived only in his dreams. "You don't sleep much, do you?" Henry's voice broke the silence, gravelly but calm. Ethan turned slightly. "Habit," he said. "You spend enough nights listening for danger, the quiet starts to sound wrong." Henry nodded, blowing on his mug. "I used to say that when I was logging. When the forest went silent, that's when you started looking for trouble." He gave a low chuckle that dissolved into a cough. "Guess some instincts never quit." Martha glanced over. "You boys talk like you've both fought wars." Ethan hesitated, eyes still on the snow. "Different kinds, maybe," he said softly. The morning wore on slowly. Ethan repaired a draft in the window while Henry tried to help, insisting on holding nails despite his trembling hands. Martha brewed weak coffee, humming an old hymn that reminded Ethan of churches half buried in sand, places he'd seen on deployment where faith clung like dust in the air. When they finally sat together at the table, Martha's gaze rested quietly on Ethan. "You lost someone," she said, not as a question, but as fact. Her tone was soft but sure, the way nurses speak when they already know the diagnosis. Ethan froze for a moment, his fingers tightening around his cup. "Everyone loses someone," he said finally. "But not everyone keeps looking for them in every shadow," she replied. Henry reached out, laying his rough hand over hers. "Martha has a way of seeing right through armor," he said with a tired smile. "Doesn't mean she's always wrong." Ethan didn't answer. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was heavy with things unspoken. Outside, the snow had turned to a faint mist, curling along the trees like smoke. The light through the frosted window was thin and uncertain, the kind of light that makes everything feel temporary. Finally, Ethan spoke. His voice was low, steady, but carried the weight of buried years. 3 years ago, my wife and son, fire back home while I was overseas. I was supposed to be the one saving lives. He stopped, staring at the table. Didn't even make it to the funeral in time. Martha's eyes softened, but she didn't speak. Instead, she reached for a folded handkerchief in her pocket, old, embroidered with fading thread, and placed it quietly near his hand. Henry exhaled, long and slow. "I'm sorry, son," he said simply. "There ain't words that fix something like that." Ethan gave a small nod, jaw clenched. "I stopped trying to fix it, just kept breathing." "That's still living," Henry said. "Sometimes that's enough." The fire popped, scattering sparks into the dim air. Martha's eyes glistened, reflecting the flame. "When I was a nurse," she began softly, "we used to say the worst wounds weren't the ones we could see, the ones under the bandages, those heal, but the kind inside." She looked toward Ethan. "Those you carry in silence until someone helps you remember you're not alone." He met her gaze for the first time fully. There was no pity there, only understanding, the kind that came from a lifetime of tending broken things. Outside, the wind began to rise again, brushing against the cabin walls like fingers. Ranger lifted his head, ears twitching. Ethan rose, checked the latch on the door, and looked back toward the couple. "You shouldn't have made it this far in that storm," he said, "if I hadn't heard the knock." Henry interrupted him gently, voice calm. "And sure. Son, sometimes we're not meant to make it alone. Maybe the knock wasn't for you to open the door. Maybe it was for you to remember how." Those words hung in the air, filling the room more than the fire ever could. Ethan sat back down, feeling the weight in his chest shift, not gone, but no longer crushing. Scout stirred then, letting out a soft yelp. Martha bent down, smoothing his fur with a trembling hand. "He's hungry," she said. Ethan reached for the last can of food from his small supply shelf, poured a bit into a dish, and set it beside the puppy. Scout licked weakly, tail flicking once, before pressing against Ranger again. Henry watched the scene, his eyes moist. "You ever think," he murmured, "that maybe God sends storms not to break us, but to push us toward where we're supposed to be?" Ethan gave a small, almost reluctant smile. "If that's true, he's got one hell of a way of showing mercy." Henry chuckled, shaking his head. "He's old, son. Probably forgot how to whisper." Laughter, soft, unsure, filled the cabin for the first time. It echoed strangely, as if the wooden walls themselves weren't used to such sound. Even Ranger raised his head, tail thumping once in quiet approval. As dusk began to creep in again, the snowlight outside turned blue. Ethan added more logs to the fire. Martha and Henry settled near the hearth, their hands clasped together as Scout dozed between them. Ethan stood for a while, just watching, the flames flickering across faces lined by years and grief, yet somehow still capable of hope. For the first time since the war, Ethan felt something shift within him. Not peace, not yet, but a sense that maybe healing wasn't a place to reach, but a choice to begin. Outside, the storm finally began to die, its long howls fading into quiet sighs across the valley. And inside that small wooden cabin, 3 lost souls and 2 faithful dogs sat together, their breaths rising in rhythm, their warmth pushing back the cold. The storm eased by dawn, leaving the mountains in an eerie silence that only follows chaos. The sky hung low and white, and every branch bowed under the weight of snow. Steam rose from the cabin chimney, twisting slowly before being swallowed by the pale light. Inside, Ethan Cole packed his worn duffel with methodical precision, each motion quiet, efficient, soldier-like. His broad shoulders moved with calm purpose beneath a faded green flannel shirt. The scars on his hands caught the firelight like faint silver threads. Old reminders that refused to fade. Henry Parker watched from his chair near the stove, his lined face thoughtful beneath his wool cap. "You're really planning to drive in this mess?" he asked, voice still rough with age but touched by concern. Ethan zipped the bag shut, eyes fixed on the window. "The pass should clear for a few miles. We'll make it to the town if we leave soon." His tone was steady, though he knew he was lying. The road had been buried deeper than any plow could handle overnight. Still, he couldn't let them stay trapped up here much longer. Martha Parker folded a blanket over the sleeping puppy on her lap. Scout's small chest rose and fell against the wool, his fur now clean and soft, a faint golden shimmer where the light hit. "We won't slow you down, Ethan," she said gently. Her silver hair, still slightly damp from melted snow, framed her face in soft waves. There was calm in her voice, but also the tremor of someone who had learned to hide fear under kindness. Ethan glanced toward Ranger, who was pacing near the door, restless. "We move when the wind shifts," he murmured, and the big German shepherd gave a low, understanding rumble. Henry chuckled softly. "Looks like someone outranks us all." By mid-morning, the storm had thinned into a steady drizzle of snow. Ethan loaded their few supplies into his old black pickup, a military surplus vehicle with chipped paint and one cracked headlight. Its engine rumbled low, steady like an old bear. The road leading down the mountain gleamed white under the dim sun. Henry climbed into the passenger seat, his breath clouding the glass, while Martha settled in the back, Scout nestled in a basket beside her. The first few miles were slow. Tires groaned over the ice, and the snowbank on either side looked ready to collapse. Ethan's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his gaze sharp and unblinking. The radio hissed with static, their only thread to the outside world. The town of Silver Ridge was 20 miles away, but in weather like this, 20 might as well be 200. "Think we'll see the sun again before spring," Henry muttered half to himself. Ethan smirked faintly. "If we're lucky." His voice carried a warmth that surprised even him. They rounded a bend, and then the road simply ended. A wall of white blocked the pass, snow and debris piled high, frozen solid. Ethan cut the engine and stepped out, boots sinking deep into the drift. The wind howled low, tugging at his coat. He touched the ice with a gloved hand and felt the unyielding hardness. "Avalanche," he said grimly. "We'll have to turn back." Martha leaned out of the window. "Is there another way?" "There used to be," Henry replied slowly, his eyes narrowing toward the east. "An old hunting trail. Haven't used it in years, but it might still cut through." Ethan nodded. "We'll try it." They turned the truck toward the side road, barely visible beneath the snow. The trees grew denser here, their black trunks slicing through the white haze. Ranger barked once from the bed of the truck, a sharp, alert sound. Ethan stopped immediately. "You hear that?" he asked. Martha frowned. "Hear what?" Then it came again, faint, distant, a sound that didn't belong to the wind, a soft, broken whine, almost human in its desperation. Ethan's eyes darkened. "Stay here," he said quickly, grabbing his flashlight and rifle. "Ranger, with me." The German shepherd jumped down, landing in the snow without a sound, ears pricked forward. Henry tried to protest. "You don't know what's out there." Ethan gave a brief nod. "That's exactly why I need to look." He followed the sound through the trees, boots crunching over ice. Ranger led ahead, his nose low to the ground, tail stiff. After a few minutes, they came upon a clearing, and there, half buried in snow, stood a derelict hunting shack. Its roof sagged, and a broken lantern hung from the doorframe, swaying in the cold wind. The sound came again, a weak whimper, almost inaudible. Ethan swept his flashlight across the drifts and froze. Behind the shack, under a collapsed lean-to, were metal cages. Half covered by snow, their rusted bars glinted faintly. Inside, dark shapes moved. "Jesus," he whispered. He brushed the snow away and revealed at least 10 cages, each containing a dog. German shepherds, huskies, a few mutts, all thin, shaking, eyes dull from hunger. Some didn't move at all. Ranger whined softly, pressing his muzzle through the bars of the nearest cage. Ethan knelt, heart pounding. "Easy, buddy. We've got you," he murmured. He yanked at the padlock, but it was frozen solid. He looked over the rows. At least a dozen animals, some no older than Scout. Who the hell did this? Martha and Henry appeared moments later, trudging through the snow. Martha's hand flew to her mouth. Oh, dear God! Her eyes widened, filling with horror. I know this! I've seen this before! Ethan turned sharply. What do you mean? She sank to her knees beside one of the cages, running her fingers over the old serial tag burned into the metal. These markings, they belong to a kennel called Ridgebrook Breeding Co. They were shut down years ago for illegal breeding. I testified against them, but the case was dropped. The owner disappeared. Her voice trembled, her breath clouding the air. I thought I'd done enough, but they must have started again. Oh, Lord, I should have known. Henry knelt beside her, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. You couldn't have stopped it, Martha. Ethan rose, scanning the area. We don't have time to argue. They won't last another hour in this cold. He turned on his radio, adjusting the frequency until static gave way to a faint voice. Silver Ridge Dispatch. This is Cole, ex-Navy SEAL, Grid 9 north of Elk Pass. Found multiple animals in distress. Illegal cages, possible criminal site. Need rescue team ASAP. The signal cracked. Copy that, Cole, came the faint reply. Storm's building again, but we'll send help if we can. Henry pointed to the truck. I'll get the headlights aimed this way. Give them a beacon. He trudged off through the snow, moving with surprising speed for his age. Ethan looked at Martha. You and Scout stay in the cab. Keep the heater running. We'll bring them out one by one. Martha hesitated, eyes glistening. Ethan, please, save them. Everyone you can. He gave a curt nod. I'll try. Ranger barked once. The signal. Ethan pulled a crowbar from his pack and jammed it into the lock. Metal screeched, then gave way. The first dog stumbled out, collapsing against him, ribs visible beneath its matted fur. You're safe now, he whispered, wrapping it in his coat. One by one, he worked through the cages. Ranger helped herd the weak ones toward the trail, nudging them forward gently. Martha returned with blankets and poured hot water into tin bowls. Here, darling, she murmured to each dog as they came, her hand steady despite the trembling in her lips. Henry's headlights cut through the snow like two watchful eyes in the dark. The blizzard had returned, thick and merciless, but this time its fury felt different, less like punishment, more like a challenge. Ethan's breath came in sharp clouds. His muscles burned, his hands were bleeding from frozen metal, but he kept going. For every cage he opened, Ranger moved to guard the freed dogs, circling them, making sure none wandered. The last cage was the smallest, a mother shepherd curled around two pups barely moving. Hang on, Ethan grunted, smashing the lock until it broke. He lifted the whole cage and carried it through the snow as the storm screamed around them. When they finally reached the truck, Martha covered the dogs in blankets, while Henry held a lantern to the sky, its flickering light defiant against the wind. Ethan collapsed against the door, gasping, his face dusted white with frost. Martha touched his arm gently. You did it, she whispered. He looked at her, eyes burning from cold and something deeper. No, he said softly. We did. Ranger stood beside them, chest heaving, his fur rimmed with ice. The rescued dogs huddled close, the heat of their bodies rising like prayer smoke into the night. As the storm closed in again, the snow turned blindingly white. But to Ethan, Henry, and Martha, it no longer looked like despair. It looked like courage, shining cold and pure across the mountain. The storm returned with vengeance, Snow swept across the trees in wild spirals, and the mountains vanished behind a curtain of white. The wind howled like something alive, tearing through the valley and shaking the old hunting shack that now served as their fragile shelter. Inside, Ethan Cole checked the last of the freed dogs, wrapping them in old blankets and trying to keep them close to the fire. The flames flickered, weak and desperate, their orange light trembling on the walls. Ranger lay near the doorway, his chest rising and falling fast, golden eyes fixed on his handler. He was tired but alert, the soldier's instinct never fading. Outside, the truck headlights cut through the snow, glowing faintly like eyes of a dying giant. Henry Parker stood near the door, holding his lantern against the wind. His coat flapped open, showing the red flannel beneath, the same one he'd worn when he first built his old cabin decades ago. The man's back was bent, but his spirit unyielding. "We can't stay here much longer," Henry shouted over the storm. "The drift's building again." Ethan looked out through the broken doorway. "We hold until sunrise. The dogs can't move in this cold." He adjusted his rifle strap and squinted into the dark. Something felt wrong. Too much noise from the wind, too little from the forest. Then Ranger growled. It was low, guttural, and full of warning. Ethan grabbed his flashlight, moving toward the entrance. The beam cut through the blizzard and landed on movement, shadows flickering between trees. Men. 3 figures emerged from the white, moving slowly but with purpose. The first was tall, lean, wrapped in a dark parka, his gloved hand holding a crowbar. The second dragged something behind him, a chain. The third, shorter and broader, carried a shotgun slung low across his chest. Their faces were obscured by scarves and goggles, but their intent was clear. "Looks like we found who cleaned out our cages," the tall one shouted, his voice sharp with fury. "You should have minded your own business, soldier." Ethan's pulse tightened. "Henry, get Martha in the truck, now." He raised his rifle slightly but kept it aimed low, a warning, not a threat. The wind screamed, carrying their voices away, and snow whipped across his face. The men advanced, their boots crunching through the ice. Ranger barked once, his body tense beside Ethan. The shorter man swung his shotgun upward, but Ethan moved first. One shot cracked through the storm, a warning blast that shattered the quiet. The men ducked, and chaos erupted. Ranger lunged forward, teeth bared, colliding with the man holding the crowbar. They rolled in the snow, the dog's growl cutting through the wind like thunder. Ethan charged after the second man, striking his arm before he could fire. The shotgun clattered away. A punch, a shove, another. The movements came back to him as muscle memory, the brutal rhythm of survival. But there were too many. The tall one swung the crowbar hard. Ethan barely dodged, the metal grazing his shoulder. Ranger yelped suddenly, a sharp cry that pierced through the storm. Ethan turned just in time to see the German shepherd collapse, blood spreading through the snow near his shoulder. "Ranger!" Ethan roared. The fury inside him ignited. He tackled the nearest man, driving him into the ground, fists striking until the snow turned dark beneath them. The others retreated for a moment, regrouping. Henry, from the doorway, grabbed a flare gun from the truck. His old hands shook, but his eyes blazed with the courage of a man who had lived too long to be afraid. He fired the flare into the sky. The red streak burst above the trees, glowing like a bleeding star in the storm. "Help's comin'," Henry shouted. Ethan stumbled back to Ranger. The dog's breathing was shallow, fur matted with crimson. Martha was already there, kneeling in the snow despite the cold. Her silver hair whipped across her face as she pressed strips of cloth, torn from her own coat, against the wound. "Hold him steady," she said, her voice calm but trembling. Her hands, though aged, moved with the precision of a trained medic. Through and through wound, bullet-grazed muscle missed the lung. He'll live if we keep him warm. Henry returned to her side, wrapping a blanket around Ranger's body while Ethan crouched beside them, his breath ragged. The gunmen regrouped at the tree line, their silhouettes shifting in the darkness. "They're not leaving," Ethan muttered. "They're waiting for the flare to burn out." Martha didn't look up. "Then we give them something to wait for." She took Henry's lantern and set it in the snow, creating a faint circle of light. "We hold this ground until someone sees that flare." The minutes stretched into hours. The storm worsened, the world turning into a blur of white and red. The flare's glow reflected off the snow, casting everything in ghostly color. Ethan crouched near the doorway, rifle ready. The attackers circled, moving closer but never fully emerging, predators in the dark. Ranger stirred weakly, pressing his muzzle against Ethan's boot. "Easy, boy," Ethan whispered. "You did good." He could feel the warmth of blood soaking through the bandages, could hear the faint heartbeat beneath his hand. Martha handed him a thermos of water. "Drink," she said quietly. "You'll need strength for both of you." Henry's voice came from behind, low but steady. "I see lights, far off." He pointed toward the ridge, where faint flickers of blue moved through the storm. Police or rescue teams drawn by the flare. "They're coming." The gunmen must have seen it too. One shouted, "We need to move." The tall one cursed, throwing the crowbar into the snow. "This isn't over." They vanished into the white, their figures swallowed by the storm. Ethan exhaled, shoulders sinking. He slumped beside Ranger, exhaustion washing over him in waves. The adrenaline that had kept him alive now drained, leaving only the ache of survival. Martha continued her work, tightening the bandage, checking the pulse. "He's strong," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "Stronger than most people I've known." When the sirens finally echoed faintly through the valley, they sounded almost like music. Red and blue lights pierced through the gray dawn as two sheriff trucks broke through the snowbanks. Officers in heavy winter coats rushed toward them, led by a man with a square jaw and tired eyes. Sheriff Mark Danner, a broad-shouldered figure in his late 40s with short-cropped hair and a weathered face that spoke of too many winters and too little sleep. He had once served in the state troopers before taking charge of this remote district, known for his blunt honesty and quiet compassion. "What the hell happened out here?" Danner asked, kneeling beside Ethan. His gaze shifted to the wounded dog, then to the cages nearby. Good God, this was a breeding site. Ethan nodded wearily. "We found them trapped, then the owners came back." The sheriff's expression hardened. "We've been tracking a ring like this for months. You just handed us the proof." Officers spread out, securing the area. A medic team arrived, one of them, a young woman named Carla with freckled cheeks and calm green eyes, knelt beside Ranger. "We'll get him to warmth," she said, running gloved fingers gently over the dog's fur. "He's a fighter." Martha leaned against Henry, tears glinting in her eyes. Ethan, half conscious from exhaustion, looked toward her. She knelt beside him, taking his cold hand in both of hers. "You saved them, Ethan," she whispered. "But maybe you don't realize you saved yourself too." Ranger lifted his head weakly, pressing his nose against Ethan's arm. Scout crawled closer from Martha's lap, curling against the older dog's side. The dawn broke slowly then, the storm fading into a quiet drizzle of snowflakes. Ethan closed his eyes, the first sunlight in days brushing across his face. Around him, rescue workers moved, voices calm and efficient. For the first time in years, he let himself rest. The long night had ended, and in its place the world felt new, fragile, cold, but alive. The snow was gone. What once was white and silent now shimmered with water and light. Streams ran freely again through the pines, carving silver ribbons down the slopes where drifts had once buried every sound. The air was soft and smelled of damp earth and thawing wood. Winter had loosened its grip, and with it, the heaviness in Ethan Cole's chest began to ease. 2 months had passed since that night of wind and blood. The cabin at the edge of Silver Creek stood stronger now, patched and mended, its wooden walls polished by new hands and new hope. The forest had come alive again, sparrows darting between branches, meltwater dripping from the eaves, and the laughter of 2 old souls who refused to give in to age or grief. Henry Parker stood outside with his sleeves rolled up, hammer in hand, driving the last nail into a fence post. His once white beard was now trimmed neat, but the wrinkles on his face had deepened around his smile. "You know," he said between blows, "for a guy who used to break down doors in foreign deserts, you're not half bad at carpentry." Ethan, tightening a joint on the wooden frame beside him, gave a half smile. "You'd be surprised how much fixing things has in common with surviving them." His arms, once tense with battle readiness, now moved with patience. The scars along his forearms caught the sun as he worked, faint silver traces of past fights now softened by the warmth of spring. Ranger trotted nearby, his left shoulder bandaged weeks earlier, but now strong again. The 7-year-old German shepherd looked older, perhaps wiser. The fur on his muzzle had lightened to pale gray, and when he moved, it was with a deliberate, noble calm. Yet, when Scout dashed across the yard, bigger now, his paws too large for his still-growing frame, Ranger sprang after him like a shadow reborn. The young dog yipped, spun, and fell into a playful bow, tail sweeping up dust and petals. From the porch, Martha Parker watched them with a smile that made the lines around her eyes glow. She wore a faded blue sweater, her silver hair pinned loosely at her nape. In her lap sat a ledger, each page filled with notes about feeding schedules, medical supplies, and the new dogs arriving every week. She had turned the small, forgotten cabin into a sanctuary, one that smelled not of loneliness, but of sawdust, herbs, and life. Behind her, 2 new arrivals, a pair of mixed-breed puppies, both rescued from the old illegal kennel, played near a basin of water. One was black with white paws, bold and curious. The other, sandy brown with a crooked tail, timid but loyal. "Patience, Clover," Martha said gently as the shy one tried to hide under the chair. "The world's not so cruel anymore." Henry leaned his hammer against the fence and stretched, his joints cracking like kindling. "Well," he said, brushing off his hands, "that's the last board. If this fence holds through the season, I'll eat my hat." Ethan chuckled softly. "That's motivation to make sure it doesn't fall." They both turned toward the creek, where sunlight spilled like molten glass across the current. Silver Creek, the name came naturally now. It was here they decided to begin again. What had started as a desperate night in a storm had become a quiet mission, to rebuild what others had broken, to give every lost soul, man or dog, a second chance. By afternoon, the 3 of them gathered near the wooden pens behind the cabin. The air smelled of pine and smoke. The soft hum of bees floated around the early blossoms. Ethan wiped his brow and leaned against the post, watching as Martha moved between the animals with practiced care. "You ever think you'd end up doing this?" he asked. She paused, hand resting on a shepherd's head. "At my age, I stopped trying to guess where life will take me," she said. "But I do know this. Healing others has always been the only way I knew how to heal myself." Henry grinned. "That's her way of saying she can't sit still." Martha laughed softly. "Maybe. But I'd rather build something than mourn what's gone." Ethan looked toward the cabin. It still bore the burn marks from old storms and bullets in its wooden siding, yet it stood, stubborn, resilient, beautiful in its imperfections. He realized it was more than a shelter now. It was proof that even the broken can stand again if someone believes in the rebuilding. Late in the day, while Henry and Ethan repaired the final section of the roof, Martha called out from the porch, "Ethan, I've got something for you." Her tone carried that mix of warmth and quiet authority that made even a seasoned seal pay attention. He stepped down from the ladder, brushing sawdust from his sleeves. Martha reached into her apron and drew out a small leather bracelet, handmade, worn smooth, the edges neatly stitched. She held it out with both hands. "It's from one of the collars we found in the storm," she said softly. "I thought it shouldn't be thrown away." Ethan turned it over in his fingers. The leather was dark and supple, and carved across its surface, in small steady letters, were the words, "Home isn't a place. It's who stays with you." He swallowed, throat tight. "You made this?" She nodded. "Every home deserves a mark of its heart, and I think you've finally found yours." Ethan slipped the bracelet onto his wrist. The fit was snug, the weight almost nothing, but it felt like an anchor. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for reminding me that the fight was worth it." The sun sank low beyond the pines, turning the sky into a river of gold. Henry, with Ranger at his side, approached carrying a small wooden sign he'd been carving for weeks. His large hands held it carefully, the letters freshly burned into the oak surface. "Thought we could make it official," he said, eyes twinkling. Ethan brushed away the sawdust and read the words aloud. "Silver Creek Rescue, where every lost soul finds its way home." Martha covered her mouth, her eyes welling up. "Henry Parker," she whispered, "that's the most beautiful thing you've ever made." He smiled at her, lines deepening around his eyes. "You helped me spell it right. That's teamwork." Together they lifted the sign onto the porch beam. The wood creaked as Ethan drove the final nail through it. When it was done, they stepped back in silence. The evening breeze rustled through the trees, scattering pine needles and carrying the laughter of dogs across the yard. Scout barked, his tone bright and playful, and Ranger answered with a deep, contented rumble. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The sign hung above them, catching the golden light of sunset. Ethan looked at the two people beside him, one old, one gentle, both stronger than they knew, and felt something he hadn't in years. Peace. The creek murmured softly behind the cabin. Spring had come at last to Silver Creek, washing away the blood, the storms, the ghosts. What remained was not silence, but harmony, the kind that comes when broken souls find each other and decide, quietly, to stay. As dusk settled, Martha called the dogs in for supper. Henry lit the lantern by the door. Ethan lingered outside for a moment longer, watching Scout chase the last butterfly of the day, his small body gliding through light that shimmered like memory. The world, for once, didn't hurt. He turned toward the porch, where laughter and the smell of stew waited. Behind him, the sign swayed gently in the evening wind, whispering its promise into the forest. Every lost soul finds its way home. In the end, the spring at Silver Creek reminds us that even the coldest winters of life eventually melt when kindness takes root. Ethan, Henry, and Martha each carried their own scars, yet together they found warmth not in walls, but in hearts willing to stay. The rescued dogs weren't just saved, they became the living proof that love, once given, never disappears. It multiplies. In our own lives, we all face storms, loneliness, loss, guilt, or fear. But sometimes healing begins not with strength, but with the courage to open a door for someone else, a neighbor, a stray animal, or even a stranger who's lost their way. Every act of compassion creates ripples that reach further than we imagine. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a little light today. Leave a comment and tell us which moment moved you most. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Subscribe to the channel to join our growing family of stories where hope is reborn, one rescued soul at a time. Because at Silver Creek, and in life, every lost soul deserves a way home. May God bless you and keep your heart warm through every season ahead.